The sun beat down mercilessly on the barren tarmac of the Nui Dat base. A hot, suffocating air clung to everything, thick with the dampness of the jungle that surrounded it. Sweat ran down the backs of the soldiers, but their attention was fixed on an unexpected sight ahead. In the near distance, a group of Australian SAS soldiers stood in the open, hunched over their rifles, focused entirely on what they were doing. Captain Marcus Halden, a U.S. Green Beret officer, squinted into the distance. The Australians were not preparing for combat in the conventional way. Instead, they were wielding hacksaws, cutting off the barrels of their high-precision rifles with the kind of determination that suggested this was no mistake, this was intentional. Each stroke of the saw seemed to echo in the humid air, drawing a confused and amused glance from Halden. What in God's name are they doing? Halden muttered to himself, eyes narrowing. He turned to his men, who stood around him in a loose formation. Look at those idiots. What kind of soldiers cut the barrels off their rifles? They won't last a week. His tone was derisive, his voice tinged with laughter. To him, the Australian SAS seemed like nothing more than a band of amateur soldiers. The US military, in his mind, had the right idea: firepower, speed, and cutting-edge technology. The Americans had M16 rifles, helicopters, and massive firepower to obliterate their enemies. But these Australians? They had their modified weapons and primitive tactics. Halden couldn't understand it. His men looked on with skepticism as well. At the time, the Americans had no reason to doubt their superiority. They had spent months in the jungle, honing their tactics, but they still believed in the might of their weaponry. They trusted the high-tech gear that had been issued to them, not realizing how ill-suited it was for the dense terrain of Vietnam. Halden's men had trained for jungle warfare, but their techniques, built on overwhelming firepower and speed, were failing. The jungle, thick and unyielding, was not a battlefield that could be dominated with mere technology. Halden's confidence in his own methods was unshakable, yet there was a small voice in his head, though he tried to ignore it, that wondered whether there was something he was missing. Halden quickly dismissed the thought and refocused. The radio crackled to life, cutting through the stillness. Captain Halden, we've got a situation. Intelligence reports significant Viet Cong movement near your location. You need to move out now. The urgency in the voice of his superior was enough to snap him back to the task at hand. Halden glanced at his men, nodding toward them to prepare for action. They would do what they did best: move fast, hit hard, and dominate the battlefield with their superior weapons and firepower. The Australians are on their own, Halden muttered, more to himself than anyone else. We don't need them. He couldn't waste time on what he considered unnecessary backup. Their rifles were clearly less effective than his men's, and their unorthodox tactics were an embarrassment. The team was already trained to win, and Halden believed that their doctrine, speed, firepower, and technological superiority would see them through. With a quick motion, he turned to lead his men out of the base and into the jungle, fully convinced that the Americans had all the tools they needed to succeed. The Australians, in his mind, were nothing more than an afterthought. As the American team made their way through the jungle, the dense foliage seemed to swallow them whole. The scent of decay and humidity clung to the air, and the thick underbrush made each step a challenge. Halden, who had spent months in this environment, moved with ease, but even he began to feel a subtle discomfort. Something was wrong. The jungle felt too quiet. The sounds of distant birds and rustling leaves, usually a constant in the air, were eerily absent. The quiet was unsettling, like the calm before a storm. Halden waved off his unease, reminding himself that it was just the nature of the jungle to change its rhythm. But then he heard it, the faintest snap of a twig. His instincts, honed through years of training, screamed at him. Without warning, the sound of gunfire erupted from the trees. It was chaos, a rapid, continuous barrage of bullets from multiple directions. The Viet Cong had been waiting for the Americans to enter their trap, and now the ambush was in full swing. Halden's world snapped into focus. His men scrambled for cover as rounds whizzed past them, the jungle suddenly alive with the deafening noise of battle. The Americans fired back, but they were disoriented. The dense foliage made it impossible to see their attackers. Their well-trained tactics for open combat were useless here. They were exposed. Move! Get to cover! Halden shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the storm of gunfire. His men, though experienced, had never fought like this. The jungle was more than just an environment, it was an enemy in itself, changing the rules of war in ways they hadn't prepared for. Halden's men were pinned down, their firepower failing to make a dent in the enemy's positions. The Viet Cong, expertly camouflaged in the dense vegetation, continued to fire, unchallenged. The Americans' high-tech gear was ineffective, leaving them vulnerable to guerrilla tactics they hadn't fully appreciated. Hal then crouched low, trying to assess the situation. This wasn't just a firefight, it was a trap. And then the worst realization struck him. Just as the ambush reached its peak, Halden's radio crackled again. The voice was calm, steady, Australian. "We're on our way, Captain. Stay put." The voice on the other end belonged to Sergeant Phillips, leader of an Australian SAS patrol. Halden's eyes darted to the jungle around him. The Australians were on their way? But it was too late, his team was in the thick of it. He had never felt more helpless. They would need backup. But could the Australians make it in time? Halden knew that the Australians weren't known for rushing in like the Americans. They were methodical. Slow. But right now, that pace felt like it would never be enough. Could their unconventional methods truly make a difference in this kind of combat? As his thoughts raced, the radio crackled again, interrupting his doubts. Sergeant Phillips' voice came through, this time with surprising calm. "You'll see soon enough, Captain. We move like ghosts through the jungle. Stay with it." Halden's jaw tightened. Ghosts? What did that mean? The ambush had happened too fast. Within moments, Halden's Green Berets found themselves trapped, their training in high-tech warfare and rapid strikes rendered useless by the dense jungle and the skilled Viet Cong fighters. Halden, crouched behind a tree, could feel the weight of his decision to leave the Australians behind. The US soldiers were pinned down in a lethal crossfire, firing blindly at shadows, while the Viet Cong, undetected, rained down bullets from concealed positions. In the stillness between gunfire, Halden's mind raced. He'd always been confident in the superiority of the US forces. After all, they had the best equipment, the best training. But the jungle had a different language, one that couldn't be understood through firepower alone. The underbrush muffled every step, the vines and trees created an impenetrable wall of green, and the air itself was thick with the scent of decay. The Viet Cong knew this land better than any American soldier ever could. As his men exchanged fire, Halden's thoughts flashed back to the Australians. He had mocked them, thinking their methods were primitive. But now, the reality was dawning on him. Speed and firepower were not the answer in this terrain. Patience, stealth, and a deep understanding of the environment, those were the traits that mattered here. "Move out, now." Halden barked, trying to rally his men, but the command was lost in the roar of gunfire. A bullet ricocheted off a nearby tree, and a man dropped beside him, clutching his leg. The desperate cries of his comrades filled the air, but it was clear they were all fighting a losing battle. Suddenly, a voice crackled through the radio. It was faint but unmistakable, the Australians. "We're on our way, Captain. Stay put." Halden's heart skipped. The Australians were coming, but would they be able to make it in time? His mind flashed to their slow, methodical approach. How could they possibly reach them before the Viet Cong overran their position? The situation was critical. Halden knew they couldn't afford to wait. But he also knew that the jungle, unforgiving as it was, would continue to twist the rules of warfare beyond anything he had prepared for. What the Americans needed now wasn't more firepower, but the kind of patience and discipline that only the Australians seemed to possess. The gunfire erupted again, louder and closer. The enemy was closing in. The Viet Cong, having anticipated their every move, were already on top of them. The crackle of gunfire intensifies as the Viet Cong move closer. Halden's team is losing ground. Can the Australians, moving slowly but steadily through the jungle, reach them in time to turn the tide of battle? The Australian forces moved through the jungle with a quiet precision that seemed almost unnatural. Sergeant Phillips, who had led countless operations in the harshest terrains of Vietnam, knew the rhythm of the jungle better than he knew his own breath. He had been taught to move like a ghost, to exist in the jungle without ever revealing himself to the enemy. It was a philosophy passed down through generations of soldiers who had learned from the land, not from books or manuals. Their pace was measured, slow, deliberate, and silent. It was a stark contrast to the urgency of the Americans, who were fighting to stay alive in the heat of an ambush. But Phillips wasn't worried. The Australians didn't fight like the Americans. They didn't need speed, they needed patience. With each step, they disappeared further into the dense vegetation, their presence undetected by the Viet Cong forces who were still focused on the trapped Americans. The modified rifles in their hands, a result of years of field adjustments, had been designed for this very environment. Shortened barrels allowed them to maneuver through the underbrush without snagging on vines, and the lack of flash suppressors meant that their shots could be taken from within the dense foliage without revealing their position. The weapons might have seemed crude, but they were perfectly suited for close-quarter combat in the thick jungle. Phillips moved ahead, scanning the surroundings. Every rustling leaf, every shift in the air, was noted, each detail feeding into his awareness of the terrain. He could feel the tension of his team behind him, but there was no rush. The Australians had learned long ago that rushing only led to mistakes. Their tactic was simple: move quietly, move slowly, and never give away your position until it was too late for the enemy to react. As the Australian soldiers close in on the ambush, the gunfire from the American position grows louder. They are dangerously close now. Will the Australians arrive in time to make a difference, or will they be caught in the same deadly trap as the Americans? The jungle was a maze, but the Australians had learned to read its secrets. They knew where the ground would give underfoot and where the trees would allow for swift movement. They knew how to walk without making a sound, how to step lightly on the earth to avoid alerting the enemy. Suddenly, one of the soldiers raised a hand to halt the movement. Phillips instinctively froze, every muscle tensed. He listened, sensing something. The crackling of the radio. The rustle of leaves. The sounds of battle from the American side were growing more intense. But there was another sound, a soft, almost imperceptible noise. An enemy patrol, just ahead. The Australians had already made it past the perimeter of the enemy's line without detection. But the enemy patrol was just ahead. Could they remain unseen, or would this be the moment everything fell apart? Phillips made a quick hand signal, and his team halted. They crouched low, remaining as still as the jungle itself. The enemy patrol, mere meters away, moved with the same care and quietude the Australians had adopted. But they were unaware that the Australians were already behind them, moving in the same spaces, breathing the same air. Seconds passed like hours. Phillips held his breath, waiting for the patrol to pass by. The slightest movement, the slightest sound, could give them away. But the Australians were as calm as the jungle itself, unshaken, their bodies trained to be still, their minds focused entirely on the task at hand. As the enemy patrol passes by, an Australian soldier nearly brushes up against an enemy soldier, but the enemy doesn't notice. The Australians' complete stillness, honed through years of training, makes them invisible in the dense jungle. The Australians had passed through the heart of the Viet Cong's territory without leaving a trace, unnoticed. The enemy, who had hunted Americans through this very jungle for months, had walked directly past the Australians, never once suspecting their presence. Phillips gave a subtle nod, signaling to his team to continue moving. They were inside the enemy's perimeter now, invisible and undetected. The rescue mission was no longer a distant hope, it was now a reality. But there was no time for celebration. The real battle was just beginning. The jungle was silent again. The occasional rustle of leaves, the distant calls of birds, and the soft hum of insects were the only sounds that accompanied the Australian SAS as they moved deeper into the enemy's territory. Their rifles, now modified with shortened barrels and makeshift attachments, were a stark contrast to the sleek, high-tech M16s carried by the Americans. To anyone unfamiliar with the weapon, the modifications would seem like an act of destruction. But to those who understood the terrain, it was the key to survival. Phillips and his team moved with ease, the custom modifications on their rifles allowing them to slip through the jungle undetected. The shortened barrels, which had once been a point of ridicule for the Americans, were now proving their worth. The Australians didn't need long-range accuracy, they needed maneuverability. In the thick undergrowth, where visibility rarely exceeded 15 meters, a rifle designed for close-quarters combat was far more effective than the American models that were designed for long-range precision. Phillips surveyed the terrain as his team moved, their footsteps soft against the jungle floor. Every soldier moved with the same practiced precision, their bodies blending seamlessly with the environment. They knew their mission wasn't just to intervene, it was to reset the balance of power. The Americans had entered the jungle expecting to dominate, but the Australians had learned to become a part of it, not to fight it. The weapon modifications weren't just about shortening barrels. They had removed the flash suppressors, removed the standard sights, and welded crude, makeshift grips made from scrap metal. It was a weapon that looked more like something cobbled together by partisans in an occupied country, not the weapon of elite soldiers. But the Australian SAS knew better. These modifications allowed them to move silently, without snagging on the vines and undergrowth, and to take quick, lethal shots in tight quarters. Phillips glanced at his rifle. The bitch, as they called it, wasn't a weapon of beauty, but it was a weapon built for survival. The short barrel didn't just make it easier to maneuver, it allowed them to stay hidden, to become a part of the jungle. While the Americans relied on firepower, the Australians had learned to adapt. As the group continued through the dense foliage, Phillips couldn't help but think about how the Americans had failed to understand the terrain. Their M16 rifles, with their long barrels and high-tech components, were ill-suited for the close-quarters combat that the jungle demanded. The Australians had learned the hard way that jungle warfare wasn't about speed or power, it was about patience, stealth, and knowing the land better than the enemy. But despite the success of the modifications, Phillips knew that the real test was still ahead. They weren't just moving through the jungle, they were moving through enemy territory, and the Viet Cong would be watching. They would know that they were being hunted, and they would fight back with everything they had. The Australians move ever closer to the American position, their patience paying off as they remain undetected. But the Viet Cong are still out there, and soon the true battle will begin. Can the Australians stay hidden, or will the enemy catch on? Back at the American position, the battle had reached a fever pitch. Haldane and his men were battered, bruised, and running low on ammunition. The Viet Cong were relentless, their guerrilla tactics making it impossible for the Americans to gain any ground. Every time the Americans fired in one direction, the enemy responded from another, always a step ahead. Haldane crouched behind a tree, his hands shaking as he gripped his M16. The firefight had lasted hours, but it felt like days. His team was exhausted, and morale was crumbling. He had seen his men fall, each one of them trained to fight in this environment, each one confident that their superior technology would see them through. But now, those very same weapons were proving to be liabilities. The dense jungle, which should have been an advantage, was swallowing them whole. The long barrels of their M16s constantly snagged on branches, and the bright flash of their muzzle fire made them easy targets for the enemy. Haldane knew that if they didn't get help soon, they would be overrun. The Viet Cong had the upper hand, moving with the stealth and precision of predators in their own home. The Americans were intruders, fighting an enemy that understood the land far better than they ever would. The realization hit Haldane hard. The tactics they had relied on in previous battles, the speed, the firepower, were ineffective here. The jungle was a different beast altogether, and they had underestimated it. As the gunfire died down momentarily, Haldane's radio crackled to life. "Captain Haldane, this is Sergeant Phillips from the Australian SAS. We're close. Hold tight." Haldane's heart skipped. The Australians were on their way. But could they make it in time? Haldane didn't have the luxury of time. Every minute that passed was another minute that the Viet Cong used to close in on them. He glanced around at his men. They were tired, terrified, and running out of options. They had been trained to rely on technology and firepower, but those tools were failing them now. What they needed was the ability to adapt, to move as part of the jungle, to become invisible. Haldane's mind flashed to the Australians, working methodically, sawing off the barrels of their rifles. At the time, he had scoffed at the thought. He had thought it was madness. But now, in the thick of the battle, he understood. Their tactics weren't about firepower, they were about survival. They had adapted to the environment, and now, it was time for the Americans to learn from them. As Haldane waits for the Australians to arrive, he can't shake the feeling that their unconventional tactics might be the key to survival. But can they really make a difference in time? The American forces are on the brink of collapse. The clock is ticking. The Americans had always believed that superior technology and firepower would win the war. But the jungle had taught them a harsh lesson. Now, as they awaited the Australian rescue, Haldane realized that the true weapon wasn't in their rifles or their speed, it was in their ability to understand the terrain, to adapt, and to move like ghosts through the jungle. But would it be enough? The sun hung low in the sky, casting a blood-red glow over the jungle. The gunfire had become sporadic, like the last gasps of a dying animal. Haldane's Green Berets were fighting for survival, their ammunition running low, their morale collapsing with each passing minute. The Viet Cong were closing in, relentless and unforgiving. In the distance, Haldane could hear the faint crackle of the radio. Sergeant Phillips' voice, steady and composed, broke through the static. "We're close, Captain. Stay put. We'll be there in 15 minutes. 15 minutes? Haldane looked around at his men, each one trying to keep their heads down, watching the shadows stretch longer as the enemy closed in. He could hear the shouts of the Viet Cong soldiers, the crunch of leaves as they moved through the underbrush. Haldane knew their positions were compromised, they were running out of time. 15 minutes could feel like a lifetime in this hellish place. The moments seemed to stretch, one after another, like a slow-motion nightmare. Haldane gripped his rifle, his fingers slick with sweat. Every movement felt louder than the last. The enemy's patience was wearing thin. They would pounce soon. Haldane's thoughts returned to the Australians. Their approach had been slow, almost painfully slow in his eyes, but now, in the midst of the chaos, he was beginning to understand why. The Australians didn't rely on speed, they relied on something far more critical in this jungle: patience. And it was that patience that would save them all. If they could just make it in time. He glanced at his men again. They had fought hard, but they were exhausted. Wounded. Every man was covered in sweat, dirt, and blood. Haldane could see the fear in their eyes. The jungle, once a space where they had felt in control, had become a merciless trap. Their tactics, their technology, their speed, all of it had failed them. Now, all they could do was wait. Wait for the Australians. Haldane closed his eyes, forcing himself to steady his breathing. He had always believed that victory came through superior firepower. That technology would win the war. But now, in the heart of the jungle, he understood, it wasn't about firepower. It was about the ability to adapt, to survive, to become part of the environment. And the Australians had mastered that. They had learned to move like ghosts, to blend with the jungle, to make themselves invisible to the enemy. As the distant sound of Australian movements draws nearer, Haldane's men cling to their last bit of hope. Can the Australians really save them in time, or is it already too late? The thick humidity of the jungle pressed against everything, from the leaves on the trees to the soldiers in the field. The sun had set completely now, plunging the landscape into darkness, and with the setting sun, the sounds of battle had quieted down. There was only the occasional crack of a branch underfoot, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, the signs of movement, but not from the Viet Cong. From the Australians. Phillips, leading his team, signaled for complete silence. Every soldier in his patrol knew their role. Their modified rifles were low in their hands, their movements deliberate, methodical. They had been trained for this. The Australian SAS had been honed in the art of invisibility, and the jungle, for all its dangers, was their ally. They moved forward, but they did not rush. They understood that rushing meant discovery, and discovery meant death. They had learned to slow down in a world that demanded speed. Every inch they advanced was taken with careful precision. Each footstep was calculated. Each sound was analyzed, and every breath was controlled. Phillips knew exactly what his men were capable of: movement that was nearly imperceptible, tracking without leaving a trace. This was their world. And with every passing second, they closed in on the American position, undetected. As the Australian patrol advances, they come upon a Viet Cong soldier, no more than a few meters away, oblivious to their presence. Will the Australians remain unseen, or will their cover be blown? The Australians moved with the ease of men who had spent years honing their craft in the wildest environments. Their training, based on ancient Aboriginal techniques, had made them the most effective jungle fighters in the world. And now, it was paying off. Phillips, ever vigilant, noticed a slight disturbance in the air, a movement, a subtle change in the way the jungle sounded. He gestured for his men to freeze. In the distance, a Viet Cong patrol walked past their position, no more than 10 feet away, completely unaware of the soldiers lying in wait just beyond the trees. The Australians didn't breathe. They didn't shift their weight. They became part of the jungle, invisible, silent. The enemy soldier stepped within arm's reach of a hidden Australian soldier, unaware of the deadly force inches from him. The soldier paused to adjust his gear, his back turned completely to the Australians, before continuing forward. He never knew he had nearly walked into death. Once the enemy had moved past, Phillips gave the signal to advance. The patrol continued, inching closer to the American position, moving like shadows, blending seamlessly with the terrain. They were getting closer to their goal, to the Americans, and to the Viet Cong lines. As Phillips led his team forward, a thought flickered through his mind. The Americans had no idea what was about to happen. They had been fighting the jungle, trying to impose their will on it with speed and firepower. But the Australians? The Australians had become one with the jungle. They didn't fight it. They understood it. As the Australian soldiers close in on the Viet Cong position, Phillips realizes that not only are they within range to strike, but they are also well positioned to observe the entire battlefield. They are about to change the game without ever revealing their position. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation as the Australian soldiers positioned themselves within the dense foliage, ready to strike with deadly accuracy. They were surrounded by a sea of Viet Cong soldiers, yet they remained unseen, just out of reach. Phillips signaled to his team to prepare for the final phase of the mission. They would call in the artillery, but they would do so with a precision that would eliminate the enemy without wasting a single round. The Americans, though unaware, were about to witness the full power of the Australian approach. It was the kind of strike that no one would expect, silent, deadly, and precise. The Australians are within striking distance, their patience about to pay off. But the real test is yet to come. Can they remain unseen as they take control of the battlefield, or will their position be compromised? The jungle was alive with sounds of warfare, shots echoing from every corner, the crack of branches snapping under the weight of fleeing soldiers, the whir of bullets whizzing by. Halden's Green Berets fought fiercely, their backs pressed to trees as they tried desperately to hold their positions. Their rifles barked in response to the Viet Cong fire, but it was futile. The dense undergrowth swallowed every shot, and the enemy, though outnumbered, had the upper hand. Halden gripped his rifle tighter, the weight of the jungle pressing on his shoulders. The firepower they relied on was useless here. Their M16s, built for long-range precision, were ineffective in this thick, wet environment where visibility rarely extended past 15 meters. They had been trained to fight on open battlefields, where technology and firepower could make the difference. But here, in the choking green expanse of the jungle, their tactics failed them. In the distance, Halden could hear the unmistakable sound of Australian voices, calm and measured, like an answer to a prayer. "We're ready, Captain," came the voice over Halden's radio. It was Phillips. "Hold tight. We're coming in hot." At first, Halden's skepticism was hard to shake. The Australians had moved in slowly, their approach methodical and almost maddeningly patient. But now, as the sound of their movement neared, Halden couldn't deny it, they were exactly what they needed. The Australians weren't charging in recklessly, guns blazing. No, they were approaching with the kind of calm precision that could turn the tide of the battle. And Halden had never felt more relieved. The Americans, pinned down and nearly out of options, wait for the Australians to arrive. But as the gunfire continues, Halden can't help but wonder, will the Australians' methodical approach be enough to save them, or will they arrive too late? The Australians didn't rush, and that was the key. Their methodical pace through the jungle allowed them to remain unnoticed, their every step a carefully calculated maneuver. As the American soldiers fought for their lives, the Australian SAS had already infiltrated the periphery of the Viet Cong's position without detection. Every movement was deliberate, silent, precise, and with a purpose. Phillips and his men, despite the thick humidity and dense undergrowth, moved like shadows through the jungle. It wasn't just their training, it was instinct. They had learned the jungle's language, the subtle change in air pressure, the shifting patterns of sound. They could tell if a twig had been disturbed minutes earlier. They knew how to hide their presence, how to blend with the land. Every now and then, one of the men would halt, raise a hand, signaling that something was amiss. Maybe it was the flicker of a shadow in the distance, or a slight disturbance in the foliage. But whatever it was, it didn't matter. The Australians didn't panic. They didn't rush. They waited for the perfect moment. Every movement, every step, was part of a carefully constructed plan, one that depended not on technology, but on understanding the terrain, the enemy, and their own purpose. Their approach was in stark contrast to the frantic energy of the Americans. Halden and his men were firing indiscriminately, struggling to keep the enemy at bay. The jungle was closing in on them, and they had no idea how much time they had left. As the Australians moved closer to the American position, they can hear the frantic exchange of gunfire growing louder. They are just moments away from intervention, but will they arrive in time to make a difference? Phillips, the sergeant leading the Australian patrol, glanced around. His team had positioned themselves expertly, concealed in the undergrowth. They were close, so close now. The firefight between the Americans and the Viet Cong had intensified, creating the perfect cover for their approach. The enemy was distracted, but for how long? A slight movement caught his eye. An enemy soldier, walking too close, oblivious to the hidden Australians nearby. Phillips' hand tightened around his modified rifle, but he didn't move. He held his position, watching the enemy soldier pass by, just inches from his position. The Australian soldier didn't even breathe. They had learned this over years of experience, how to stay completely still, how to blend into the surroundings so that nothing about them stood out. As the enemy soldier moved past, Phillips gave the silent command to advance. His team slipped forward, each member moving with the same quiet efficiency, their movements as fluid and graceful as the jungle around them. As the Australians silently infiltrate the Viet Cong's rear, Phillips orders a sniper to take out a key target, a Viet Cong officer. One shot, one kill. And just like that, the battlefield shifts. The Australians were about to turn the tide of battle, but no one knew it yet. The American soldiers had been fighting desperately for hours. Their position was dire, and the pressure was mounting. Haldon's once confident demeanor had given way to frustration. His team was surrounded, and their ammunition was running low. The radio crackled with updates from command, but they were of no use now. The orders were clear: survive. Hold your ground. But it seemed like an impossible task. Just as Haldon was about to issue another command, the radio crackled once more. This time, it wasn't a report, it was a voice. Calm, steady, unwavering. "We're here, Captain." It was Phillips. The Australians were close now. Haldon didn't need to hear more. He knew what that meant. The tide was about to turn. As Haldon's team holds their breath, the first signs of Australian intervention become apparent. Gunfire from the Viet Cong pauses as Phillips and his team begin their assault. But will they be able to hold the line long enough? Will the Australians' intervention be enough to save the Americans, or will it be too little, too late? Phillips' team was positioned perfectly. From their vantage point in the dense jungle, they could see the battlefield unfold like a chessboard. The Viet Cong, thinking they had the Americans pinned, were in for a rude awakening. The Australians had moved silently, unnoticed, and now they were ready to strike. They would hit the Viet Cong where it hurt the most, at their command center. With a signal from Phillips, the Australian snipers opened fire, picking off key Viet Cong officers with deadly accuracy. The shots rang out, silent but effective, each one striking its target without fail. The Viet Cong, who had been so sure of their advantage, suddenly found themselves in disarray. The Australians, though few in number, had turned the tables. Haldon could hardly believe his eyes. The Viet Cong forces, once so organized and confident, were now retreating, scattering in the face of the precise, calculated strikes from the Australian team. It was as if the jungle itself had turned against them. The once deadly ambush was unraveling in real time, and Haldon watched as his men began to regroup, regaining the confidence they had lost earlier. The Americans, having been caught in a deadly trap, are suddenly freed by the Australians' precision strikes. The Viet Cong, unprepared for the Australian assault, retreat, leaving their equipment behind. The battle has shifted in favor of the Americans, but at a cost. The final moments of the battle were swift. With the Viet Cong retreating and the American forces recovering, the Australians moved in to help consolidate the position. The aftermath of the firefight was staggering. The Viet Cong had lost dozens, their command structure decimated by the precision of the Australian snipers. The Americans, though battered, were alive. And they owed it all to the Australians. As the battle winds down, Haldon, shaken by what he has witnessed, reflects on the outcome. The Americans may have survived, but at what cost? And more importantly, what lessons would they take from this encounter? Could they adapt to the jungle as the Australians had?